And there's the link in the chat.
Thank you. And we'll get some music going, right?
We get music. Do I get to weigh in on the options?
Sure. What do you want to play?
No, I'm joking. Whatever you play.
I was trying to find some Kanye West like songs, but I couldn't find.
Let's not do Kanye. Anybody but Kanye.
I was like, I can't find anything that might.
See, that's the universe cooperating.
Yes.
I'm gonna play some Pharrell.
In the chat.
Might seem crazy what I'm about to say.
And we'll get some music going, right?
We get music. Do I get to weigh in on the options?
Sure. What do you want to play?
No, I'm joking. Whatever you play.
I was trying to.
Yeah, like I don't care, baby, by the way. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like a room without a roof. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like happiness is the truth. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you know what happiness is to you. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like that's what you want to do. Here come bad news, talking this and that. Well, give me all you got and don't hold it back. Well, I should probably warn you, I'll be just fine. No offense to you, don't waste your time. Here's why. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like a room without a roof. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like happiness is the truth. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you know what happiness is to you. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like that's what you want to do. Bring me down, can't nothing bring me down. Your love is too high. Bring me down, can't nothing bring me down. I said, bring me down, can't nothing bring me down. Your love is too high. Bring me down, can't nothing bring me down. I said, because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like a room without a roof. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like happiness is the truth. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you know what happiness is to you. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like that's what you want to do. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like a room without a roof. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like happiness is the truth. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you know what happiness is to you. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like that's what you want to do. Bring me down, can't nothing bring me down. Your love is too high. Bring me down, can't nothing bring me down. I said, because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like a room without a roof. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like happiness is. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you know what happiness is to you. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like that's what you want to do. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel.
Excellent. Welcome to our third community conversations with Zachary Parker, who is running for Ward 5 Council. And welcome, Alan, and welcome, Mr. Perry. Thank you so much, Zachary, for joining us today. And I am really happy to have you here. As you're familiar, like what the purpose of community conversations is to ensure that the community and our families are able to have conversations with those running for office and get to have that in-depth, communication, understand what's going on, and to basically get to know you. So great to have you. And I would love to start with you just sharing a little bit about yourself and your platform.
Thank you, Khadija. And I am really excited to join you all for this next hour or so to share a little bit more about my candidacy and my campaign and vision for Ward 5. I am currently the Ward 5 representative on the State Board of Education, as well as the immediate past president of the board. I was elected in 2018. And as folk may imagine, I'm a former 7th grade math teacher and educator. So I come to this space with that experience, but that also of those close to me that I love. I often share that I'm the youngest of 3 children. Born to my parents, and my brother's lives serve as a constant motivation for me in my life. My oldest brother works 40 plus hours a week without health insurance and many worker protections. He, like so many Ward 5 neighbors, struggle to make ends meet. My middle brother was born with chronic kidney failure and passed away in 2016. And I watched him and his life literally fight for his life against the greed of insurance companies that tried everything not to cover basic healthcare needs. And what my campaign is about is meeting the needs that I've had an opportunity to see firsthand as I've been doing the work on behalf of Ward 5. In this council race, I'm the only current elected ward-wide official in this race with real and current policy and budget experience. And those experiences have shown me that many families like my oldest brother are struggling to make ends meet. They're grappling with DC's affordable housing crisis. Our young people are dodging bullets as they go to and from school, and many families are fearful of engaging in routine activities, whether that is going to the park or just going to grab a bite to eat. Many of us see how our ward and our city is changing drastically. And while change is not always bad, much of that change is happening to communities versus with communities. It's happening as a result of the greed and the lack of oversight, I would argue, of developers and the corporate class in our city versus with the input and partnership of communities and parents like yours here at Rocket Ship. So I'm running and I'm offering a vision of building healthy communities where all neighbors can have their needs met. And doing that not just as a platitude and a slogan, but doing it as a way of meeting the basic needs of all neighbors through expanding affordable housing, making sure that we address rising violence by addressing the root causes of violence, making sure that we strengthen our schools so that children don't have to ride buses across town just for the promise of the hope of a quality of education, but at the same time that parents can make the best choice for their child and their family. That our seniors can age in place, and that they, while grappling with the changing environment in their own communities, can stay in the homes that they probably bought for a fraction of what they're going nowadays, and so much more. And so I invite neighbors who may be watching or who may see this video to join and learn more at zacharyforward5.com. And I would imagine we will get to this, but I would just name several things that make me different from others in the race. There are a lot of choices in this Ward 5 council race, and I think that's a good thing. Voters should have a plethora of quality options from which to choose from. As I mentioned, though, I am the only current ward-wide elected official in the race, and have been doing the work of Ward 5 for several years now, and have real budget and policy experience. Secondly, I've amassed the greatest amount of grassroots support in this race from everyday Washingtonians and over 24 community leaders, from ANCs and civic association leaders, from PTO leads to council leads. I'm also proud to be endorsed by our Attorney General Carl Racine. And last but not least, and I would argue most important, I'm the only leading candidate in this race that is not directly tied to corporate lobbyists or to the establishment. And that is important because our only hope for change and changing course in Ward 5 in our city is to disrupt the systems that perpetuate violence, displacement, and corruption. And the only way I believe you could do that is by being outside of the system. And so again, I welcome this opportunity to answer your questions, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. And I've also invited community organizations that represent and support the families that Rocket Ship serves. And I would love for them to introduce themselves and their work. So let's start with Alan.
Good evening, everyone. If you see me looking this way, I have an 8-month-old that I need to tend to from time to time. But first of all, thank you so much for coming tonight, especially you're showing right now in this moment your grassroots drive and focus with meeting such an intimate group, allowing us to ask these questions. So just thank you. My name is Alan Rogers. I'm the Advocacy Director for Homeless Children's Playtime Project, where we provide safe spaces and with partnerships with shelters to provide safe spaces for kids who are either in short-term family housing, rapid rehousing, or currently seeking shelter in our established sites. And so just really excited to see the work to come to support our kids, our children in this community in order to make sure that they receive the resources they deserve, the access to counsel that they deserve, and the voice that they obviously deserve as our future for this district. So really excited to be here tonight. And thank you once again, Khadija, for the invitation.
Absolutely. And now let's go to Mr. Perry.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Scott Perry. I'm the Partner and Development Director with the Edgewood Brooklyn Family Support Collaborative. Just celebrated our 25th anniversary. Primarily serve families in wards 5 and 6 with case management services, utility assistance, truancy prevention, homeless services, as well as workforce development. And glad to have the opportunity to hear about your platform and learn a little bit more about you.
Awesome. And it looks like maybe you're celebrating a birthday too in the background.
Yeah, actually, my birthday was in November and I've just been too lazy to take the banner down. Thank you.
Well, happy belated birthday.
Belated. Thank you so much. And Joanna Smith, I saw that you just joined. Would you like to briefly introduce yourself? And she may be on childcare duties, so we will skip over her and we'll jump right into the questions. So the first question I have for you, Zachary, is what DC and Ward 5 do you represent?
Yeah, I represent working class DC, everyday Washingtonians. I have family that grew up in Ward 5 and in DC. And I still have cousins in the area, some of whom now live in Oxon Hill, Maryland, because they can't afford to live in the city and in the communities that they grew up in. And that relates again to the story of my oldest brother. And I'm very fortunate to be blessed to live a certain life, but I also know that that comes with a responsibility. So I'm very proud to represent working class Washingtonians.
Thank you so much. And what constituencies would you say you have the strongest connections with? And which constituencies do you feel like you need to do further outreach with?
Yeah, obviously as an educator, as the State Board of Education, past president and representative, my strongest constituency would be that of families, young parents of children and school-based personnel. I've also had close contact with our seniors and have done a lot of work over the years. And so as I make this journey to hopefully becoming the next Ward 5 council member, I see it less around which constituencies should I lean towards over another, but more so how do we bring the community together and meet the basic needs of all neighbors in a way that I've been trying to do for our families for the last several years.
And your experience, being an education representative, like some may say that you have experience, primarily in education. And so how would you say that you possess the experience to lead as a council member, which, encapsulates a variety of different issue areas?
Absolutely. I am proud to be an educator. And so I come to this work not being a career politician, and I actually think that is a huge strength. And it is a differentiating factor from several folk in this race. I also come to this race as the only candidate with real budget and policy experience. I can talk about policies that have now been introduced to the council, and that is experience that can be leveraged as the next Ward 5 council member. But I've also been very intentional and deliberate by being very clear where I stand on policies. from how we can expand affordable housing to how we can fight for labor, how we can address the rising violence, how we can expand our green infrastructure, how we can make our streets safer. And so neighbors can visit zacharyforward5.com and see no less than a dozen policy platforms. And I would say that is a stark contrast from every other candidate in this race. And the reason for that is less to prove that I can do this because I'm an educator, but any good educator knows that it's best to do your homework, but also to plan ahead. And that is what I am doing, and just being very clear where I stand on the issues.
Yep. And definitely, I'd say if there's one thing that people would say about you is that you're very prepared. And so to kind of, there's being prepared, and then sometimes you just kind of make mistakes, and you got to have to know how to, recover from that. So from that lens, like thinking about, your work, would you say that there are any, or not rather, would you say, can you give an example of a time where you feel like you kind of made a mistake, either in kind of collaboration or in kind of like work that you feel like you've really grown from? Because I think it's really important for constituents to kind of see like what is your style, like kind of like when you have to fix things or make corrections, because everyone makes mistakes. Absolutely. But it's really important. How do you navigate those situations?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. In this line of work, you're always learning. And I pride myself on never knowing everything and always being open to learning. I would say one thing that I learned early was the importance of engaging community stakeholders in a way that I don't think I did when I originally ran for the State Board of Education. And I'll give context to what I mean by that. I'm an educator. Since 2013, I've been working in our school community. So I was the one attending PTO meetings, not ANC meetings. I was the one engaging with families, not in the Wilson building. And when I first decided to run for the State Board of Education, for me, for many educators and folk that knew me, it was a no-brainer. But it was also a shock to the political class in Ward 5 and in DC. And so over the years, I've been able to build those relationships with key stakeholders in the political realm within Ward 5 and DC. And that's, if I had an opportunity to do it over, I think I would have done my due diligence a little bit earlier. So instead of trying to backtrack and build those relationships, that I would have done it on the front end before jumping in the State Board of Education race. Although I'm glad I did. I just think I took for granted that the education world was synonymous with the political world. And I learned very quickly, it is not. It is not.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. And now I'll turn to Scott and Alan and Joanna to ask any questions. And I'll also check to see if there are questions like on our different streaming areas.
Can you elaborate a little on, you referenced affordable housing earlier, which I always hear that phrase, but it's rare that I hear somebody break down what they consider affordable housing. Are we just talking about renters? Are we talking about affordable housing programs so people can purchase homes? What does that mean to you, and how can you feel that you can address that?
No, that is a good push, because I agree. You will hear every candidate say, oh, I care about affordable housing, as well as every elected official will say that. And we are in an affordable housing crisis. What I mean by that is drastically increasing our affordable housing stock where working class people can afford to stay here, where Native Washingtonians who were born and raised in the city can stay in this city even as it gentrifies rapidly. There are a few ways that I call for doing that. But before I get into those strategies, it's worth calling out what our status quo is, which is largely, let's build, build, build. We will funnel money to developers with the promise that they will give us 5 units here, 10 affordable units there. And eventually we will reach some magic number that will allow folk to stay in the city. The subtext to that reality is that tens of thousands of Black folk have been pushed out of DC for the last 10 plus years. Folk like my own family that now live in Maryland because they cannot afford to stay here. And so what I'm calling for is a way to build community wealth, but also to make sure people can stay here. And it has to be a multifaceted approach. We do need to build more, but we also need to make sure we expand the HPAP program so that those who want to buy a home and perhaps are seeking to do it as their first home of residence can actually qualify. There are many programs like HPAP where maybe you make a little bit too much to be fully on the lower end, and you don't make quite enough to really be able to buy the house in certain part that you want in certain parts of Ward 5. So by expanding the qualification and the income spectrum, we can make sure that more neighbors can take advantage of that. Anybody that has taken advantage of the HPAP program would also tell you that the paperwork alone precludes many neighbors from taking advantage of it. And so we need resources so that neighbors can actually take advantage of the program. Secondly, instead of funneling hundreds of millions of dollars to developers, that with the promise of them giving us 10 or so affordable housing units per luxury building for a building to be affordable for only 30 years, we could be doing and scaling community land trusts. And we already have the Douglas Commonwealth Community Land Trust in the district. And the idea there is that instead of giving the $100 million to the developer, you give it to this land trust where community members get to have a say around the development, who gets to move in, and how we are going to build this housing for community use. And then lastly, I think streamlining regulations within DCRA. There are many neighbors that have basement units, attic units, many of which are off the books, if you will. And many would say they are doing that because the regulations at DCRA are just too onerous. The fees are out of whack for many neighbors. And while it is important that we meet regulations, I do think if we incentivize residents to go through a streamlined process, we can bring more units on the books and therefore get housing to more neighbors that drastically needed. Last point I'll make is that what we define as affordable housing in DC does not meet the need of those at the lower rungs of our socioeconomic status. And so for my oldest brother, who works 40 plus hours a week without medical insurance and who barely makes ends meet, he, even with the qualifications of affordable housing in the district, it would be hard for him to qualify for many places. And so we need to lower the threshold so that we can have more units where folk at 30% or so AMI can actually afford to stay here. So those are just some concrete strategies around how we can actually expand affordable housing in the district.
Okay, thank you. And it's interesting you mentioned HPAP because I actually went through HPAP to purchase my home about 3 years ago. And like you said, the paperwork, it took me 6 months just to get my approval letter. I'm submitting the same document multiple times to DC government. And the challenge with HPAP was I made okay money. And what I qualified for, there were so many other people in DC who could afford that and triple what I applied for. So when I went after a house, so did 30 other people. And it was just real competitive. But yeah, thank you.
No, that is real. And it just speaks to, it's not enough for us to have the programs. We have a lot of district programs and resources. Right. We don't always make them easy for people to take advantage of. I think of the state EC program where I was happy to help over 100 seniors take advantage of that program. And I can assure you, the average senior would not have been able to sit for 40 minutes and fill out that application where you had to scan this and log this and put your email here. Many of them didn't even have an email. And so the question, that for me that raises is, how do we be laser focused about implementation? The policy is one thing, the resource is one thing, then how do we implement it so that it's truly effective in meeting folks' needs?
Thank you.
Alan.
Hello. So once again, thank you for being here this evening. So I wanted to ask in regards to your personal experience with the idea that one size fits all is false. It doesn't. In regards to the last couple of years dealing with schools struggling to catch and support students who have struggled academically, socially, emotionally during the pandemic. I wanted to ask your methods in which how we would support, and I'll put this on two layers, our students with dealing with COVID learning loss, and then how we would further support homeless students with dealing with COVID learning loss. So I look forward to your answer.
That's such a simple question. I appreciate it. Yeah, it is. The pandemic has been devastating for our young people, for our schools, our educators. I think there's a teacher crisis that no one is really paying attention to that I really worry about, and that we are quickly approaching a cliff. That we could talk about another time. I think in terms of students generally, there needs to be a needs assessment across the board, starting with our students with special needs. We know many of them have not received the services that they were due or that they need for now 3 school years. And the question and something I've been pushing for is how do we do a special needs audit? To simply, not to pass blame, not to shame schools, because we know people, have been trying to do the best that they can. Parents have been doing the best that they can. And nobody really anticipated that there is a pandemic. At the same time, we need to have a baseline of information to know where our young people are to move forward. So the first thing for our young people, whether that they are experiencing homelessness or not, is to have a baseline. And I'm not just talking about standardized testing. I mean, mental health baselines, making sure that if they were due services, where are they in relation to those services? Do they need compensatory services or support? How are they doing socially? These things we aren't talking nearly enough about. And I just worry that we're going to rush too quickly to get back to the math and ELA testing and miss how our students are doing and the joy factor, as well as how our teachers are doing. In terms of our students who are experiencing homelessness in particular, I'm proud of the work that I've been doing with folk at Playtime Project, with folk like Jamila Larson and many others, whether that was fighting for bus services with the DME to make sure that young people who were experiencing homelessness could still make it to school, or just making sure that they were able to experience the joy of Christmas or other holidays by giving them toys and resources. I think it's a lot of the same. I don't think of it as, our young people experiencing homelessness need something different. It's much often, in my experience, a little bit more. They need more intense support. They need more of that baseline investigation to see where they are and how do we prioritize their needs in this coming school year. Hopefully I got to your question.
I would like you to just address a little bit deeper with the more concept for homeless students. Yeah. Because I mean, based on the work, there's always this idea of equity, but then there's also the evaluation of previous trauma, previous support.
That's right.
That was missed.
Right.
So just give me an opportunity.
So yeah, I would highlight the 3 areas that I called out: mental health. How do we do a 100% baseline needs assessment for every student? And that, I guess that's my point, that I wouldn't just do it for students experiencing homelessness, but for every student. But for our students that are experiencing homelessness, how do we intensify their interventions, the supports? How do we prioritize them in the front of the line in terms of assessing their needs and getting them the supports that they need? In this budget cycle, one of the things I'm calling for is an increase in out-of-school time funding. I think that's important for our students who are experiencing homelessness, and for those that may be watching that may not know what that means. It's essentially out-of-school time programming or extracurricular programming. It could be extracurricular, it could be instructional, sometimes it's both. But how do we intensify those supports for our young people experiencing homelessness? That is very important, as well as the mental health, as well as the social, as well as the academic. I don't want to underestimate that importance, but I wouldn't necessarily put that as number one, just given everything we've gone through these past 3 school years.
Perfect, thank you.
And thinking about the education piece, some would say that it doesn't make sense to really hyper focus on, achievement because of all that's been going on. But then others would say, actually, we do need to have a hyper focus on achievement because, especially with our most at-risk populations, we need them to do well. We need them to be able to be college and career ready. And so how do you strike that balance, especially when, as a council member for Ward 5, there are multiple public and public charter schools that have, different ways of addressing that, that very issue. How do you see yourself like striking that balance? What will be the things that would be at top of your mind? Because we want to make sure that our schools have what they need to support kids, particularly at-risk kids. We also need to make sure that that's not an excuse to not ensure that our students are achieving as well. So how would you navigate that?
Yeah, absolutely. Student achievement is obviously very important for me. Ward 5 has the third lowest performing schools in the city if we look at just pure achievement. What I know to be true is that even before the pandemic, our schools were not doing all that great. Coming out of this pandemic, now that 3 school years have been disrupted, all I'm saying is we need to treat our young people in totality and treat the whole child. And we cannot just put them in front of a teacher and do rote drill practice to prepare for a standardized assessment. We must make sure that they are mentally well, that we must make sure that there is social dynamics that are healthy and that are allowing space for a productive learning environment. And I would just point you to the rise in violence across the city. I will point you to the incidents of violence with our young people in and out of school, including several young people who have lost their lives. We must deal with some of those other dynamics that directly impact how far our students are learning in the classroom.
Thank you. And I believe Joanna has a question.
Hi, Zachary.
Hi, Joanna.
Hi. My question is, you mentioned it in passing when you were talking about something else, but I want to talk about teacher retention because I do agree, like it is a big deal. There are many. It's like a multi-alarm fire that's about to happen, and I feel like there aren't enough people really talking about it. So I'm curious from your perspective, since you're running for the Ward 5 seat, what do you think the city can do about it? Because I know that in many conversations I'm a part of, it's like what each individual LEA is going to do, and there's definitely a role there, right, for us to have strategies to address retention. But I am curious, like, what are the citywide levers that you think would be important to make sure that we're in a good place for next year and for future years?
Yes, we are in a crisis that I don't think many people are talking about. So thank you for recognizing that. First thing I would say is we need more data. I'm very proud that the state board has been a leader on this teacher retention issue. Many years ago, many district leaders denied that teacher retention was even an issue here. Now we know and recognize that DC has amongst the highest turnover in the country. And while I applaud OSSI, our state superintendent's office, for making progress in this area, we still don't collect data that tells us why teachers are leaving the classroom. We know how many are leaving the classroom, and there are many. We have yet to codify in a systematic way the reasons why. So to get to your question, we need to know what are the influencing factors that are pushing teachers out of the classroom. That is actually one of the policy pieces that I helped to introduce to council. And so Chairman Mendelson has promised that there will be a hearing for this legislation on behalf of the State Board of Education that would do just what we're talking about. Require OSSI to codify not only how many teachers are leaving the classroom, but why. Things that I think think we can and must do for our teachers is to make sure we're addressing their mental health. We talk about our young people, and that's important, but our teachers are also experiencing mental health. And I support on-site technicians there to provide supports for our teachers. I think making sure that we support our teachers with training, with actual support, and balance that with accountability. I fully honor and I fully agree that teachers should be held accountable to producing for our young people, full stop. That said, what I know to be true is in many of our schools, we're holding teachers accountable. We're slapping them on the wrist. We're saying they're not what they're not doing. And what we're not doing enough is saying how they can get better, providing them long-term coaching, et cetera. And then the last thing I would say is making sure that we're providing well-rounded education for our students, but that also creates a more enriching learning environment and school environment for our teachers. So school environment improvement support, long-term teacher coaching support, as well as making sure that we're providing mental health support resources for our teachers would be really helpful.
Thank you. And I want to open the floor and make sure there aren't any other questions that want to be asked.
What current or former council members would you compare yourself to? And do you think you would, I don't want to say necessarily replicate their work or their style, but just that you admire and would aspire to maybe continue their work?
Yeah, I get this question a lot. And I would say, I believe I would make a very unique council member. So it's hard for me to say I would be like this council member. And in fact, there's a lot of positive things I can say about many of the current council members. And so that's hard for me to answer. What I would say, though, is I would likely align myself with the council members that are fighting for people over profit. I would align myself with the council members that are willing and able to hold district agencies accountable to doing the things for district residents that they're supposed to do, whether that's DDOT, making our streets safe for residents, whether that's the housing agency, not misusing $80+ million that is meant for affordable housing, whether that is making sure we support and build out the infrastructure to truly create safe communities so that we can address the rise in violence. So I won't give you a specific name, but hopefully that gives you an ethos that I would probably align myself with.
All right, thank you.
Also, to go off of Mr. Perry's question, in regards to you getting the seat and following into this position as council member for Ward 5, one thing I like to ask candidates about is, what are the methods that you've previously used to make sure that you keep in contact and have respectable replies to constituents in a timely manner?
Yeah, no, I've maintained a robust newsletter. I think one of the things that is often said about me is that I often show up. So I'm not just showing up during this election season, but I was still in those PTO meetings and the ANC and Civic Association meetings, the block meetings, even when, you know, it wasn't necessarily required to. And so I think showing up is very important and something I pride myself on. And many people in and around Ward 5 have my personal cell phone number that they can text me and call. Obviously, the busier you are, that becomes a little bit overwhelming. But those are still the habits that I would plan to keep up should I make it to be the next Ward 5 council member.
And then to part two that question, I would like to ask, what is your process of you hear an issue or a concern coming from a constituent? What process do you take to get it from point A to point Z?
Yeah, process is very important. I would tell you one of the things I hear most often from Ward 5 neighbors is that they have a deep concern about their engagement with government. They send an email, they don't get an answer back. They make a call, they don't get a call back. They see certain elected officials and sometimes they speak, sometimes they don't. That's not how it should be. And so if and when a resident makes a complaint or raises an issue, the first thing is to log it and to hear that resident out. And so I've said that within my office, there would be at least a 48-hour turnaround that you would have some representative from my office reaching out to learn more about your need, whether that's a water main leak or whether it's district services are not up to your liking, what have you. Secondly, it is investigating and trying to verify the facts in the situation, working with district agencies and leads to make sure that we're meeting the need, and then circling back with that resident to let them know how and why or why not their need is being met and how we can follow up. And I would just share with neighbors that even during this campaign, I've launched a Ward 5 help team to help meet many of those needs that I would expect I would hear in a Ward 5 council's office. And so if neighbors want to learn more, again, they can visit Zachary4ward5.com. There is a address you can reach out, and a member of our help team will help you log a complaint, make a 311 request. We'll walk the community with you. We'll schedule a neighborhood cleanup. Some of the things that have gone lacking, frankly, in our community, and are things that we just want to pay a little bit more attention to.
Perfect, thank you.
I have a couple of submitted questions I'll ask you, but I'm going to ask you a fun question first before those. So what trait of yours would your fans say as like your best aspect about you, but your haters would say at the same time, what would that trait be?
And it has to be the same trait? Yes. One, I don't think I have fans, by the way. Supporters. I'm not a rock star or anything. I think I could be pretty relentless in I think, a good way. And I think that's what you would want in a council member conducting oversight or trying to meet a need, whether that's a community issue or what have you. And what I know, having worked in district or served in district government, is that sometimes persistence can be seen as a nuisance. And so I think some haters, if you want to use that phrase, may say, oh, that is not, that's not a good thing. But I think many supporters and voters would welcome that type of relentlessness to meet the needs of our community.
Thank you. Thank you for humoring me. And so now for the submitted questions. So one is, homelessness is a powerful reminder of DC's racialized income inequality. Do you support tax reform that would more equitably distribute wealth around DC and ensure that the Black and Brown people who built DC are positively benefited by the region's growing prosperity?
Without a doubt. Absolutely.
Awesome. And then the next question is, what is your view on evicting homeless encampments? Recently, the DC Council failed to pass emergency legislation that would have prevented encampments from being evicted during the winter. How would you have voted and why?
Yeah, before I answer that, I think I call it propaganda. There's a lot of propaganda about a lot of issues, and I think this is one of them. To level set, no one wanted homeless residents to stay outside in the cold. I think the propaganda machine suggested that if you didn't support the district's program, and the program essentially promised to expedite housing for people experiencing homelessness. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. That is great. I agree with that. What was in fact happening, though, was that residents were being promised housing. And then when we got to the fine print and the numbers, not all of the residents who had been promised housing actually got it in time before the bulldozer was coming to clear their few belongings that they had in this world. The question then was, well, then what do we do about it? And I was of the thinking that we need to expedite the process to get people into housing and make sure that we can keep them in safe and community until that process happened. And so I just want to level set, because I think how it was framed in the media was that there were some over here that were for expediting housing for homeless people, and everybody else wanted the homeless people to sleep out in the cold. That's actually not what the legislation was pushing for, but it was to make sure that the few or the majority, depending on the encampment, could actually make it into housing before their few belongings were ripped from them. And in fact, many will recall that there was actually an individual that was bulldozed. And so I'm just of the mind that we can address the city's needs and operate a government with a bit more humanity than that.
And then one more submitted question on my phone from a resident, Maria Hardy. Since DC has surplus budget funds this fiscal year, can we request modifications to the Fort Lincoln Park plan to now include either the indoor pool, an outdoor splash park like Langdon, and or a dog park? Our community pool is too small and overcrowded, especially for younger kids who can't swim. A splash park next to the pool instead of a water wall placed all the way on the other end of the park would allow for safer play. An indoor pool would address the lack of swimming classes available and provide exercise for seniors as well. Finally, we just need a dog park. The population in our neighborhood is growing exponentially with new townhouses and apartments. We need more space to play and grow. Can we meet the need?
Yes, and yes. I am a proud dog owner, and I know the importance of a dog park. And oftentimes, dog parks are trivialized as some amenity or luxury. But until you have a dog that needs to go into a park, you realize how hard it is, especially in some of our communities. A few things in that question I want to address. One, the city does have a surplus, and we've had a surplus for many years now, upwards of $500 million, put differently, $500 million. What that says is the crisis that we're seeing in housing, the crisis that we're seeing in our schools, where our buildings are literally falling apart, and the list goes on, doesn't have to be, because we have the resources, and yet we as a city are not putting the money where we could to meet the needs. Secondly, we are facing an eviction crisis in DC. Some 40,000 households are facing eviction, and we have within our means the ability to stop the eviction crisis right now. The mayor today, the council today it will require the mayor to use some $150 million to stop some 40,000 households from being at risk of eviction. In addition to dog parks and splash parks, which are important, and we need those things, there are some also basic fundamental needs of our community that a city as prosperous as ours should be meeting. In terms of the green space, the parks, I've put out a number of platforms, as I mentioned. One of the things that I'm pushing for is a broader view of healthy communities, which includes expanded green space, which includes more dog parks, splash parks, playgrounds, fully functioning playgrounds and rec centers, making sure that residents can take advantage of our public spaces like the Dunbar High School track, for instance. And we, again, have the resources. This is now budget season, and we should be expending money to make those amenities available in all corners of our ward, because I would say certain pockets of Ward 5 have all of those things and more. And we shouldn't be satisfied until all residents can enjoy splash parks, dog parks, functioning rec centers, and more.
And I think we have time for one more question from each of our two guests on. So Alan, Perry, if you each have like a question or two that you guys would like to ask, and then we'll close.
Actually, I don't think I have any other questions. Everything I wanted to know got answered, and really appreciate your time, Mr. Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. And I appreciate the work you do.
Thank you.
just as an opportunity, first of all, thank you once again. If you could give us 2 to 3 of your top priorities, just to reinvigorate us on when or if that opportunity does come, when you did receive the election for the council member seat, what are the top 3 actions that you would first like to go in, evaluate, and start to work on?
Yeah,
And on a micro, I'm sorry, and on a micro level.
Yeah, I'll first name like focus areas. So 3 key priorities for me is violence. I think that's a key priority for everyone. And again, there's a debate. There's a lot of propaganda at play in our city that would like to point and blame and say that we should lock up young Black boys and young Latino boys. And I take direct offense to that. And I think the only way we're going to get out of the crisis that we're in terms of violence is by expanding educational opportunities. So the work that you all are doing here at Rocket Ship and schools across Ward 5, making sure that we're expanding economic opportunity and getting real jobs into the heart of our communities where Ward 5 neighbors are able to earn a living and earn fair wages and have worker protections, and expanding recreational opportunity. And so again, I talked about out of school time programming earlier, but that requires a multifaceted approach that we're not talking about. It also includes making sure we focus on mental health services and getting MPD officers out of their cars. And the list goes on. So that is one area. Expanding affordable housing is a second area. And I've already talked at length about strategies to advance that. And the third, not surprising, is education. There is so much that we need to do in terms of education. I'll just name very quickly something that is very important to me is support. My professional career was supporting school leaders and teachers. It was around coaching schools to turn around their practice, to go from good to great or not so good to great. And in our city, we have the stars, we have the report cards, we have the accountability. There is just insufficient support for our teachers, for our school leaders, for our schools. So those are 3 focus areas. In terms of the first lines of action I would do, it would be conducting a needs assessment across Ward 5 to see where the community is at that time. It would be around building key relationships. It would be around strengthening constituent services, which I know is a priority immediately for Ward 5 neighbors. It would it would be around holding accountable district agencies that have a backlog of requests, whether that's DPR or DDOT or DGS. Just yesterday, I think Ward 5 has over 100 requests for DGS that have yet to be met. So my first priorities would be around strengthening constituent services, conducting a needs assessment, and going immediately to district agencies to try to zero out the many requests that have been lagging for some time now.
Joanna, we have time for one more question before we wrap up, if you have any.
Well, I'll ask the question that I know that you've talked about already, Zachary, but I want to hear it myself just because I probably missed it. So some would say that it would take a fair amount of hubris to say, I want to be a DC, council member, right? And I'm just curious. I mean, you talked about being a teacher, of course, on the state board. Sorry, I got my little one with me. Like, what kind of prompted you to say, like, it's time to take that next step? And like, what things did you see in Ward 5 that you felt like you could address?
Yeah, as I mentioned, my work on the State Board of Education has just given me a very unique perspective to the needs of Ward 5 families and communities. There were 2 very specific things that made me decide to run. The first of which was a number, upwards of 5 trusted community leaders, some of whom did not support me when I first ran for the State Board of Education, that said, we think you would make a fine council member because of the work you're doing, because of your work ethic, because of your approach, and we think you should consider running. I then took that as an opportunity to have conversations with other community leaders. And one after one, they all say, yes, we think you should do this. Not necessarily that they would vote for me, but that they did think I should throw my hat in the ring. And I really appreciated that. Secondly, it was the pandemic and the vaccination rollout. And Joanna, I think you were among the neighbors that came out when we were trying to go door to door to help neighbors make a plan to get vaccinated. And while many would say the city has done well, and I think kudos to the mayor where we are today in terms of our COVID-19 response. If you remember, the early response didn't look like it looked today. And in fact, it was very bleak for many parts of Ward 5. And I was just dismayed that neighbors in Brentwood and Trinidad and Carver Langston and communities that are cut off from so many resources, it was like the Hunger Games. And for me, that connected to the need for housing, that connected to the need for quality education, and the list goes on. And that was what ultimately prompted me to jump in the race.
Thank you. And now with our last few minutes, like just share whatever you feel like you haven't been able to share or your wrap-up speech.
Yeah, no, thank you again for hosting this. I appreciate. I think more schools, organizations, nonprofits should get involved and get people involved. So thank you for hosting this. And as I said earlier, Ward 5 neighbors will certainly have a choice in this election. And I actually think that's a good thing. I think healthy competition is good. And I hope to be the next Ward 5 council member because we need a transformational leader as we emerge from this pandemic to meet the many challenges our communities face, namely with violence, with displacement, a rise of corruption within our government, but also the needs as it connects to education. And I would just repeat the things that make me different from all of the others in the race. And that is, I am the only current ward-wide elected official with real budget and policy experience. I bring that day one to leverage on behalf of Ward 5 residents. I've amassed the greatest amount of community support in this race with over 24 community leaders, trusted community leaders that are backing me. And that speaks to the work that I've been doing for many years now on behalf of Ward 5, not just during this community election season. And I am the only leading candidate that is not directly tied to corporate lobbyists, developers, or the establishment. It doesn't make them bad people, but it does call into question their ability to fight for Ward 5 residents and only Ward 5 residents. And so with those things and more, I hope to be the next Ward 5 council member. If you're interested in learning more, please visit ZacharyForWard5.com. And on June 21st, I hope to earn your support. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure speaking with you, and thank you for answering all the questions, even my weird ones. And
questions.
Thank you. And just so the audience knows, we're going to have we have 2 more scheduled community conversations. One on March 16th with Harry Thomas, and one on March 24th with Faith Gibson Hubbard. And once the others are scheduled, you will find out about those too. Thank you so much for joining us with Zachary Parker, who is running for Ward 5 council seat. And have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Good night, everybody.